presentation, I'll explore contemporary artists' moving image and sound work that deals with Ruinscapes and the nuclear uncanny in the British landscape, including Empty Set's Charles Finite, exploring an ex-nuclear power plant in Wales, Emily Richardson's Cobra Mist, and Jane and Louise Wilson's Blind Landing, both made in Orford Ness, and Mark Fisher and Justin Barton's On Vanishing Land, based around a walk on the Suffolk coastline. I'll explore the concept of landscape as one that's in flux, but onto which socio-political concerns are projected or inscribed. Caterina Albano describes how cultural relationships to fear and uncertainty have been expressed in many recurrent aesthetic forms, from the sublime to the uncanny, where Brian Dillon notes that a specific form of landscape prevalent in contemporary artists' works is the military-industrial complex and its ruins. As an artist, I've worked with landscape representations in moving image and sound, and I'll give a broad overview of research I undertook in order to explore how I both produce and consume ruinscape representations, to reconcile their subjective affective dimension with their socio-political context and the ethics of their representation. These works have an aesthetic that some people may deem an apolitical revivalism of retro-futuristic Cold War aesthetics, in monochrome or with a limited colour palette, concrete architectonic forms, and with atmospheric dark-wave soundscapes. But I'll explore them more as being hauntological, in the sense used by Simon Reynolds, borrowing the term from Derrida, and exploring the notion of haunted audio, where spectres of the past continue to haunt the present, and to explore them with a more critical nostalgia. It's been noted by J.J. Charlesworth that a feature of contemporary Western cultural imagery is a vague but widespread sense of uncertainty about the state of humanity, especially following the 2008 economic crisis. Fear has an ongoing, continuous presence in society, yet as Albano notes, it is the very lack of specificity or fixity that makes fear so powerful. These artists' works explore the materiality of ruinscapes and how they inform sensory experience, but could also perhaps be seen as metaphors for other kinds of forms of ruination and decay, where Svetlana Boym notes that ruins can function as existential topographies. Here the ruin could be seen as a kind of in situ archive, where exploration of a landscape is a means of de-archiving or retrieving information. Artists' landscape representations could also offer an alternative kind of archive, where the use of abstract or haptic images may be more evocative than mimetic realism, to register the affect of the ruinscape beyond the cognitive, and to generate information that may not necessarily have a direct practical application. To draw from Sigmund Freud's use of the description by Friedrich Schelling, the uncanny is that which ought to remain hidden or secret that has come to life. In Nuclear Borderlands, Joseph Masco writes on the nuclear uncanny and how post-1945 the invisible power of the risk of nuclear radiation as colourless, odourless substance engaged new psychic and cultural registers. The nuclear arms race embodied many contradictions, with simultaneous promotion as a national security project and normalization of the presence of the nuclear into everyday life, and the concealment of nuclear testing and its social and environmental impacts. This secrecy displaced it into the realm of the unthinkable, acquiring qualities of the sublime or the uncanny, allowing its proliferation in the realm of the imagination. To the lay public, without specialist equipment, nuclear radiation is hard to identify, a rupture in one of the basic cognitive frames of orientation to the world, in the inability to evaluate risk through bodily senses, in face of a new, non-localizable threat with an uncontainable global presence and a futurity beyond the human life scale. There have been many modes of translating the nuclear to representations perceivable by the human senses, including the effects of nuclear radiation on film captured by Vladimir Shevchenko, the sonification of the nuclear through the Geiger counter, as well as sound recordings of Chernobyl's nuclear exclusion zones by artist Jacob Kierkegaard and Peter Cusac's Sounds from Dangerous Places. The following works are not attempting to capture or translate the presence of nuclear radiation itself, but more the psychic anxiety surrounding the nuclear legacy. Empty Set's Trausfinite is a single-channel moving image piece, an impressionistic tactile exploration of the interior architecture of a nuclear power plant in the process of being decommissioned. And here is an extract from the piece. The soundtrack was formed from projecting sound waves into the interior and recording the echoes back as a mold of the space or a mirror. Modern conceptualizations of the relationship between vision and knowledge within the filmic frame and the time-space linearity of filmic sequence are disrupted. The viewer attempts to orientate themselves in space through fixed, grounded architectural markers, but these are continually unsettled, fragmented, and jarred in the flickering images, appearing as spatial warping, as described by Anthony Vidler, as the projection of anxieties onto built forms. Juliana Bruno writes about the act of filming as an archaeological process itself, where recorded moving image or sound have the characteristics of ruins in also bearing traces and marks of the architectural site. As well as Mark Riley, after Derrida, noting that image and sound recordings are phantoms that haunt the cinema, combining a past of the recorded event and the present of the audience viewing it. As well as recalling the architectural space, the aesthetic of Trausfinite recalls earlier experimental cinema, where the graininess, glare, and burnout are reminiscent of structuralist filmmaking. Emily Richardson's Cobra Mist is a 16mm film made at Orford Ness, the site of former laboratories of the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment and of Cobra Mist, the Anglo-American experimental Cold War radar station. And here is an extract from the piece. The panorama and time-lapse sequence as tropes in modern cinema are here used to evoke what is absent, showing the vast stretches of coast as an abandoned, unpeopled landscape. Writer The Haunted Shoreline suggests that the coastline could be seen to represent a threshold between the conscious and the unconscious, where Orford Ness, as Paddy Heasel has described it, is a land of secrecy, privacy, and mystery, of curiosity, challenge, and discomfort, as well as evoking W.G. Sebald's The Rings of Saturn, in which the protagonist explores the Suffolk coast, recalling memories and describing its military vestiges as remnants of a post-apocalyptic future. Cobra Mist's unsettling soundtrack is composed from layers of field recordings from the site, where Reynolds, as well as David Tuke, contend that the cultural perceptions of sound as being less tangible has a particular capacity to invoke the phantasmal and evanescent, or haunting and spectral. Also drawing on the history of Orford Ness is the site-specific intervention Blind Landing by artists Jane and Louise Wilson, named after the former Blind Landing experimental unit nearby at RAF Woodbridge. The piece comprises of a sound installation mimicking the landings of unspecified objects and sculptures of aluminium measuring sticks similar to those used on film sets to measure scale and perspective, acknowledging the filmic language and appeal of the ruin, as well as how the work is seen by the audience within the site from viewing platforms, which also allude to structures of surveillance and remote viewing as a continuing theme in their work. This is one of their earlier pieces shot at Chernobyl, Atomgrad, and also a piece, Toxic Camera. And I was going to play a short piece from Stalker, but I don't have time. So I'm going to move on to On Vanishing Land, a sound piece by Mark Fisher and Justin Barton that records an 18-mile walk taken in 2005 from Felixstowe inland to Sutton Hoo near Woodbridge. The audio essay interweaves locations and time periods with cultural references from H.G. Wells to M.R. James's Victorian ghost stories to Brian Eno's 1984 album Ambient 4 on Land. The narrator reflects upon the notion of the eerie as that which is outside of the self, rather than a more interior psychological form of the uncanny. The eerie is about being transformed elsewhere, an incursion from the unknown where external forces can be encountered. The piece references the military past of the coast, the capitalist present of Felixstowe Port, as well as its projection as a future ruin in this clip, which features music from Gazelle Twin.
Buckling, partly collapsed mountains of containers, covered in vines and small plants. Odd air flowering in the summers. A fox covering paths through thickets, willow herb and blackberry. Thistledown drifting through the canyons. The village is near Wolf.
The eerie, or a schizophrenic alienation, is incurred in splitting the sounds from any visible source. Also featured in the piece his music from barren modern to modern music and Rain, both of whom could be considered part of a new dark wave or new industrial, a resurgence of industrial and dark wave music subcultures from the 1980s, as well as still being resonant in a contemporary context, being described by Rory Rowan as making austere music for austere times. That's not to say that these are direct cultural products of a collective condition or collective subconscious. That would be too deterministic. But there is an enduring appeal that something seemingly primordial exists, that which is beyond our comprehension, and that despite attempts to represent it, remains unrepresentable. Yet Reynolds also notes that there is a self-conscious effort to make the past, or signifiers of the past, feel strange or haunted, as he says, an attempt to turn the past into a foreign country. These multiple layers of cultural representations of haunting also contribute to the status of these locations and a sense of uncanny familiarity, yet distance. To conclude, I'd like to address how certain landscape representations are used and consumed, the discrepancy between imaginaries of haunting and ruins as material realities, and the ethics of aestheticizing military and nuclear sites, and perhaps another ethical dimension regarding artistic representation if the works are then exhibited in commercial spaces. Masco offers the nuclear uncanny not only as a figurative device, but as a way to explore the political impacts on the US landscape that targeted minority communities for nuclear projects, as well as the global production chains for nuclear power, from uranium mining to nuclear waste storage, that is part of contemporary global capitalism and growing environmental inequality. Julian Stalabras describes a contemporary version of the pastoral landscape tradition, shifting the historical gaze of power from the landowning class towards a cultural aesthetic appreciation of economically deprived areas or landscapes of conflict by those who are not forced to live in them, as well as an increase in what Jane and Louise Wilson have called dark tourism, including sites of nuclear disaster such as Chernobyl. I am also aware of the power dynamics inherent in Western landscape production, especially in the context of this conference panel in relation to landscapes experiencing conflict in Palestine and Lebanon, and the role of Britain in political interventions in the region and the formation of current ruins. Further questions could be asked in face of potential nuclear weapons use in Iraq and Syria and Fukushima's ongoing radiation leaks, where Sabu Koso claims that Fukushima symbolizes the end of romanticism as the nostalgic admiration or awe to an unknown power, and a shift towards a recognition of the dark side of being in the world. Yet it's not necessarily the aim of these specific artists' works to be politically didactic or highlight the risks associated with nuclear power, but more to be evocative and suggestive, to be affective rather than reducible to illustrative explanations. These works speak of a future that may be pessimistic or bleak, but the realm of the unknowable also has the potential to be liberating as a space to form new cultural imaginaries. Thank you.